Good morning. The bibliographic references and the publisher's source article are accessible in the description under the video. If you want to support the dissemination of scientific knowledge, subscribe, and can you give it a thumbs up please? Pre-eradication updated seabird survey including new records on Amsterdam Island, Southern Indian Ocean, under exclusive license to Springer Verlag GmbH Germany, part of Springer Nature 2024. Abstract. An invasive predator eradication campaign is planned for 2024 on Amsterdam Island, one of world's top priority island for seabird conservation. In order to monitor the effects on seabird colonies post-eradication, a survey of burrow nesting species and population monitoring of albatrosses, penguins, skuas and terns was organised pre-eradication. Several counting techniques and acoustic methods were used to infer presence/absence of burrow nesting species and to estimate abundance of other species, as well as genetic methods for species identification. In total 14 breeding seabird species were detected on Amsterdam Island, among which 8 burrowing petrels including 2 species never described on the island, the Juan Fernandez petrel Pterodroma externa and the sooty shearwater Ard mcgreisia. Based on these new data, the introduced mammal eradication campaign on Amsterdam, if successful, will likely be extremely beneficial for seabird conservation and may also favour the colonisation of Amsterdam by new seabird species. Introduction. Amsterdam and St. Paul Islands in the South Indian Ocean share zoogeographic similarities with the Tristan da Cunha group in the South Atlantic and the Chatham and Juan Fernandez groups in the South Pacific. Since its discovery, in the 16th century, Amsterdam has experienced several human-related ecological perturbations and damages. At least 22 bird species are known or suspected to have bred on Amsterdam prior to first human contact, but several species are now locally extinct, among which endemic species. Today, a total of 10 bird species breed on Amsterdam, including one introduced passion and 9 seabird species in northern rockhopper penguin Eudypts mosli, Indian yellow-nosed albatross Thalasarch carteri, endemic Amsterdam albatross Diondia amsterdamensis, sooty albatross Verbetria fusca, soft-plumaged petrel Pterodromolles, grey petrel Procellarius cinerea, Macgillivrae's prime Pachyptila macgillivrae, Antarctic tern Sternavitata sanctipauli, and subtropical brown skua Catharacta antarctica Hamiltoni. Amsterdam is a critical breeding ground for 4 globally threatened seabird species of the Amsterdam albatross, Indian yellow-nosed albatross, sooty albatross and northern rockhopper penguin. These last 3 species have worsened dramatically during the past decade, with extremely low reproductive success and declining populations. Declines are mainly caused by the occurrence of avian cholera and possibly iciblas that induces high chick mortality, and by introduced mammals that predate eggs and chicks, invasive house mice Mus musculus, brown rats Rattus norvegicus and feral cats Felis catus occur throughout Amsterdam. These constitute a major threat to seabird populations, and their eradication is a priority conservation objective. On Amsterdam, an eradication campaign of all the 3 invasive mammal species is planned for 2024 as part of the RESAGE project financed by European Union, French Development Agency and French Southern and Antarctic Territories Administration. The eradication of those 3 invasive mammals species is included in the National Plan of Actions to improve the conservation status of the Amsterdam albatross. Recent studies showed that to assess the success of invasive predators management, research should provide a comprehensive feedback, incorporating pre- and post-eradication dynamics of seabird populations. Expected impacts of eradication campaigns on seabird populations are mainly due to removal of predation due to invasive species, diet changes in relation to elimination of substitute prey, and potential negative effects of secondary poisoning for scavengers. Therefore, on Amsterdam long-term seabird, monitoring will be necessary to evaluate changes due to rodenticide application and due to the absence of invasive predators. Penguins, albatrosses, and to a lower extent skuas, have been regularly monitored since the early 1970s on Amsterdam. The population trends and demographic processes are relatively well known for some of these species. In contrast, knowledge of burrow nesting species is insufficient and fragmentary. Species belonging to this group are notoriously difficult to detect and census, as they spend daytime offshore to feed and come back to their breeding colonies at night. Moreover, Burrows are often difficult to detect, particularly in dense and tall vegetation such as on Amsterdam. From fossil remains, several species have been identified as originally breeding on Amsterdam. Several species of genus Pterodroma, Pachyptila, and Puffinus, the common diving petrel Pelecanide urinatrix, white-faced storm petrel Pelagodroma marina, white-bellied storm petrel Fragetta grallaria, and non-identifiable specimen of genus Oceanites. However, these petrel populations have declined dramatically or disappeared due to introduced predators. Only Macgillivrae's prion, grey petrel and soft-plumaged petrel still appear to breed on Amsterdam, but in very low numbers, and breeding sites remain poorly known. As part of the planned eradication programme, we conducted several surveys on Amsterdam between 2021 and 2022 during seasonal breeding activities of seabirds with the aim of inventorying breeding seabird species, especially the nocturnal burrow-nesting seabirds. Here, we report some of the first results from these surveys documenting the unexpected discovery of new breeding species on Amsterdam Island. Material and methods. Amsterdam Island is a small uninhabited volcanic island situated in the southern Indian Ocean, north of the subtropical front and 85 km north of St. Paul Island. For conspicuous surface nesting seabirds, we censused the whole island population using entire sampling methods. For these species, surveys were performed during the incubation period late September 2022 for northern rockhopper penguins, late October 2021 for Indian yellow-nosed, late October 2022 for sooty albatrosses, mid-November 2021 for skuas and Antarctic terns, and April 2022 for Amsterdam albatross, for which the entire population is monitored annually. We recorded locations and counted all nests of Amsterdam albatrosses and skuas occupied by incubating adult. For northern rockhopper penguins, Indian yellow-nosed albatrosses and sooty albatrosses, the number of occupied nests was determined from photographs taken from fixed points during the early incubation period. The presence of a bird on a nest was considered as indicative of a breeding bird sit on top of an egg. For Antarctic terns, which breed in coastal cliffs, we since used most of the island coastline by visual surveys. Between late November and mid-December, an observer followed the coastal contour of the island and scanned for terns' nests or displays of territorial or nesting behaviours. Shorelines that could not be accessed on foot were scanned using binoculars. Territorial pairs and occupied nests were counted. For burrow-nesting seabirds, we used a combination of various methods to detect breeding sites. Our aim here was to assess species presence and breeding status, but not abundance. First, we used passive acoustic monitoring to determine species presence. We used autonomous digital recording devices called song meters. Song meters were programmed to record from dusk to dawn, starting 1h before sunset and stopping 1h after sunrise with 15 min on/off cycles. They were deployed in suitable habitat for burrow-nesting seabirds, but also near tall grassy slopes, potentially providing shelter from wind and wave noise. Song meters were deployed at 65 different sites on the island. Most deployment sites were situated near coastal cliffs, and HESAM-4 were deployed every 500 to 1000 m. We mainly targeted coastal sites, as on nearby St. Paul Island most burrowing petrels breed near coastal cliffs. The island was then divided into a grid 500 times 500 m to report the presence of song meters and the presence of species detected. At each deployment site, audio recordings were carried out for at least 20 nights in summer and/or in winter between January 2021 to December 2022 in order to cover the breeding period of all potential summer and winter breeding species. Data were downloaded and sonograms were compared by a human observer with publicly available recordings to identify species identity. When vocalizations were detected from acoustic recordings, we searched for burrows in a 50 m radius circle around song meters. When one or more burrows were found, we deployed camera traps near the entrance of the burrows to determine occupancy and breeding status. Finally, we used video cameras with external displays to check burrow contents and to record breeding status. In some cases, biometric measurements and blood samples were collected when acoustic criteria and photographs from camera traps were insufficient to identify species with certainty. Birds were captured by hand in or at the entrance of the burrows and were examined for presence/absence of brood patch, morphometric measurements, body mass, and blood sample from the alar vein was taken after capture of the bird using a 25-gauge needle. Blood samples were stored on FDA cards until analysis. Birds were released at the entrance of the burrow immediately after processing. The entire process took around 5 minutes. Opportunistic observations of birds not monitored in surveys described above were also recorded. For each opportunistic observation, number of individuals, date, time and GPS position were recorded. For all species, the breeding status was assigned according to the following criteria. A confirmed breeder was an individual seen with an egg or a chick or herd during all or most of the breeding season. A probable breeder was an individual seen in a burrow but without an egg or chick or herd during a part of breeding season. A probable non-breeder was an individual heard on rare occasions. DNA was extracted from a blood sample obtained from an individual of genus Pterodroma suspected to be Juan Fernandez petrel Pterodroma externa, using an E. A tissue DNA kit. For this specimen, a 649 BP fragment of cytochrome B was amplified by polymerase chain reaction using primers acitp Pro5F acitp Pro9R detailed in Pyle et al. In 15 μl reaction volumes containing 5 μl2 turned TAC PCR must mix 0, 5 μm of each primer 4, 5 μl DH2O, and 2 μl of template DNA. Cycling conditions followed instructions for the QIAGEN TAC PCR master mix. PCR products were cleaned using ISO-PIT and sequenced in both directions using an applied Biosystems 3730 DNA analyzer. To confirm species identity, the obtained cytochrome B sequence was searched against the BLAST database. Additionally, the sequence was aligned with sequences of other Pterodroma species and Aphrodroma brevirostris as an outgroup obtained from GenBank. A phylogenetic tree was built under maximum likelihood using R-AX-MLNG1. 0 with a GTR plus I plus G substitution model and 20 independent searches. Results. Counts of occupied nest sites of surface nesting species are shown in Table 1. The most abundant species was the Indian yellow-nosed albatross with approximately 29,700 breeding pairs, followed by the northern rockhopper penguin and the sooty albatross with approximately 500 breeding pairs. Other species were less abundant with inferior to 100 breeding pairs. A total of 4,279 recording days were obtained from song meters, resulting in 20,395 H of recordings which were analysed. About 81% of sampled cells revealed acoustic contacts. This resulted in 2,359 acoustic contacts corresponding to burrow nesting seabird species. Combining results obtained from all survey methods, a total of 11 burrow nesting species were detected, of which 6 were breeding, 2 probably breeding and 3 likely not breeding. 8 of these burrow nesting species were previously unrecorded from Amsterdam either as breeders or probable breeders or on land. The fish-footed shearwater Ardna carnapes, sooty shearwater Ardna gricia, Juan Fernandez petrel, black-winged petrel Pterodroma nigripenes, great-winged petrel Pterodroma macroptera, spectacled petrel Procellaria conspicillata, black-bellied storm petrel Fragetta tropica, and common diving petrel Pelecanoides urinatrix. Only one individual identified as a Juan Fernandez petrel could be captured in February 2022 from measurements and blood sampling. Searching the obtained cytochrome B sequence of this Pterodroma individual against the BLAST database identified the best match as Pterodroma externa, with 1 substitution and 85% sequence identity. The next closest matches were 2 Galapagos petrel Pterodroma phaeopygia individuals with 12 substitutions and 15% sequence identity. In a phylogenetic tree, the individual placed with the Pterodroma externa individual found by BLAST searching, and these 2 sequences were sister to individuals of Pterodroma phaeopygia and Hawaiian petrel Pterodroma sandwichensis. These results confirmed the identity of this individual as Juan Fernandez petrel. A total of 7 burrows used by flesh-footed shearwaters and between 3 and 5 burrows used by sooty shearwaters were detected with camera traps. Data indicated the regular presence of birds at these burrows throughout the breeding season, and territorial behaviour and matings were filmed. However, most of burrows were too deep to reach the nest chamber using the burrowscope. 1 breeder of sooty shearwater with an egg was observed in 1 burrow with the burrowscope in December 2021. In the same period, An adult flesh-footed shearwater was observed in a burrow. Later in the season 2 young downy chicks were seen in these same 2 burrows. However, breeding was unsuccessful as no chick was later observed, neither during burrowscope inspection nor on views obtained from camera traps placed in front of burrow. From camera traps, up to 3 adults morphologically similar to the identified Juan Fernandez petrel were observed on several occasions vocalizing and making courtship near a burrow, and 1 individual was observed digging another burrow nearby. However, the nest chamber was too deep for the burrowscope and could not be inspected. No chick or fledgling was detected on views taken by camera traps. 1 burrow frequented by great-winged petrel and 4 burrows frequented by grey petrels were detected in cliffs but were inaccessible to be inspected using a burrowscope. 1 spectacled petrel was observed in flight at dusk in late April 2022 but was not re-observed later. Discussion. Before this study, 9 seabird species were known to breed regularly on Amsterdam, all of which were detected during our survey. Although in 2012, 1 pair of northern giant petrels Macronectes Halley was breeding on Amsterdam, and 1 pair of Australasian gannets Morris serrata was reported trying to breed, none of these species were observed breeding during our survey in 2021 and 2022. We detected 8 seabird species previously unrecorded from Amsterdam, all procellariiforms and all burrow nesting species. These included 2 Ardner shearwaters, Teterodrilla, 1 procellaria, 1 pelicanides, and 1 Frigetta species. Among these new recorded species, at least 5 were frequently detected during most of the breeding season with individuals regularly observed frequenting burrows. Therefore, it is extremely likely that these species were breeding on Amsterdam, although breeding could be confirmed only for the flesh-footed shearwater and sooty shearwater with individuals observed incubating an egg or a chick. We discuss below these new and confirmed records of burrowing species and changes in numbers of surface nesting species. Antarctic tern. This species breeds on islands throughout the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic Peninsula. Although breeding colonies were reported since the early 1930s on Amsterdam, there is no accurate count of the island breeding population. During our survey, all coastal areas were prospected except about half of the length of the western coast, which remains inaccessible. Thus, our estimate of 92 territorial pairs and occupied nests was considered as a minimum of number of breeding pairs. The breeding population on nearby St. Paul with more than 500 pairs in 2018 have dramatically increased following the eradication of black rats. Some tropical brown skua. This subspecies breeds on Tristan and Goa archipelagos and on Amsterdam and St. Paul. The breeding population at Amsterdam has been increasing since the early 1970s when less than 10 pairs were breeding on the island. The species was persecuted until it was declared protected in 1972 by the Terres Australes et Antarctiques Françaises administration. Since then, breeding numbers have increased from 15 pairs in 1983 to 78 in 2021, corresponding to a 1.04 annual population growth rate. Several factors may explain this increase, such as the protected species status and the sharp increase of subantarctic fur seals Arctocephalus tropicalis as skuas feed on seal placentas and carcasses. Northern rockhopper penguin. In the southern Indian Ocean, the species breeds only on Amsterdam and St. Paul. Other breeding localities are situated in the southern Atlantic Ocean. Results of the 2022 count indicate that the population decline is ongoing on Amsterdam, with a 66% decrease in the number of breeding pairs since 2015 when 161 breeding pairs were counted. The decline of northern rockhopper penguins at Amsterdam has probably occurred since the early 1950s. Segansek estimated the entire Amsterdam population at 1.000 breeding pairs in the early 1970s, and there is evidence that 1 colony went extinct between the early 1950s and the early 1980s. The causes of decline were discussed in Barbrod et al. And include predation of eggs and chicks by introduced Norway rats and feral cats and by native subtropical brown skuas and infectious agents. However, the decline was relatively important between 2021 and 2022 and may have partly resulted from an additional cause of mortality. Indeed, in February 2021, while adult northern rockhopper penguins were molting on Amsterdam, a fire occurred in Ontrecaster Cliffs where most penguins molt. Short visits to this site after the fire revealed the presence of burnt corpses of penguins on molting sites hit by the fire. Amsterdam albatross. This endemic species from Amsterdam Island has been increasing since its discovery in the early 1980s, and our count data indicate that the population is still growing with a record number of 65 breeding pairs in 2022. Although the at-sea distribution of the species largely overlaps with longline fisheries, individuals are not or very poorly susceptible to bycatch. Moreover, this species does not seem to be impacted by infectious diseases present on Amsterdam or by introduced predators. Sooty albatross. This species breeds on several islands of the southern Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Only 3 counts of the entire breeding population are available for Amsterdam. Thus, although a previous study based on counts of the entire population suggested a decrease over the past 20 years, our recent population count and data from demographic study plots rather suggest a stable population on Amsterdam. Indian yellow-nosed albatross. The species breeds on several islands of the Crozet, Kerguelen, Marion and Prince Edward archipelagos in addition to Amsterdam and St. Paul. The population on Amsterdam Island has been decreasing over the last 34 years mainly due to infectious disease and predation by introduced mammals. Yet, compared to previous counts of the entire population in 2006 and 2015, our count in September 2021 suggests that the population trend is relatively stable during the past 15 years despite these persisting threats. Contrary to northern rock arbor penguins, adult Indian yellow-nosed albatrosses were poorly affected by the fire at Entrecasteaux Cliffs in February 2021, where only chicks died from fire resulting in a very low breeding success. Thus, the relatively high number of breeding pairs in 2021 may be partly due to the high breeding propensity of individuals that failed earlier during that year. Black-bellied storm petrel. The species breeds on several Antarctic and subantarctic islands as well as on Tristan da Cunha and Gough Islands. The taxonomy of Fregetta storm petrels is highly debated, as Fregetta tropica and Fregetta grallaria co-occur at some localities and because of plumage polymorphism in Fregetta grallaria. However, both species can be easily differentiated from sonograms, and the sonogram from Amsterdam matches well with the black-bellied storm petrel. There is no fossil remain corresponding to black-bellied storm petrel on Amsterdam, and the species is only rarely observed at sea nearby the island, generally in April. However, an individual with an incubation patch was captured on St. Paul in December 2018 and another was also captured in December 2017. This, combined with the acoustic contacts detected during our survey in May, October, and December, although they were few, indicate that individuals visit Amsterdam and St. Paul and eventually suggest the possibility that the species breeds in few numbers on these islands. Macgillivrays prion. Macgillivrays prion was known from a single population on St. Paul, but recent genetic and morphological studies found that Gough Island medium-billed prions belong to the same evolutionary lineage as Macgillivray, representing a new population of Macgillivrays prion that originated through a colonization event from St. Paul. Macgillivrays prions breed in high numbers on Gough Island in the South Atlantic, where therry were recently discovered. On Amsterdam, we only recorded this species in January and October with very few contacts. Macgillivrays prions were breeding in high numbers on Amsterdam as evidenced by the abundant fossil record, and are still known to breed as a relict population due to the presence of introduced mammalian predators. Our few observations of this species suggest that the detected individuals were likely not breeding or were prospectors visiting the island. Indeed, breeding numbers on the nearby St. Paul Island have largely increased over the past 20 years following the eradication of black rats. Moreover, remains of Macgillivrays prions have been found in pellets of brown skuas on Amsterdam Island in 2019 and 2020. Black-winged petrel. The species breeds on several islands of the southwest Pacific where it is abundant and seems to be expanding into the Indian Ocean with birds seen breeding on Round Island off Mauritius, several individuals observed on St. Paul, and 2 sightings made at sea approximately 300 km northwest of Amsterdam and St. Paul in November 2018. Our single acoustic record in January suggests that the species is likely not breeding on Amsterdam, but shows that individuals are visiting the island. Yet, we cannot entirely exclude that a breeding population of black-winged petrels could have been overlooked on Amsterdam or St. Paul. Juan Fernandez petrel. This endemic species breeds at Juan Fernandez Island in high numbers and the population appears stable. The species is one of the most commonly sighted seabirds in the subtropical Southeast Pacific Ocean, and during breeding individuals undertake northward transequatorial migration in the North Pacific. Thus, our record at Amsterdam is well outside the expected range of the species. Nevertheless, recent records in French Polynesia and in Chatham Islands and Tristan da Cunha provide evidence that it very occasionally ranges westward at mid-latitudes. Our data show the regular presence of the species on Amsterdam from December to May, thus covering most of the known breeding season at Juan Fernandez. Observations of several individuals in burrows strongly suggest that the species breeds on Amsterdam. Given that the species was never observed at sea offshore Amsterdam and St. Paul, it is likely that this constitutes a relatively recent colonization event. Interestingly, Worthy and Juventin indicated the former presence of one large Pterodroma species on Amsterdam based on fossil remains, potentially corresponding to the size of Pterodroma externa. Worthy and Juventin attributed these fossil bones to Pterodroma macroptera, but our record suggests that some may belong to Pterodroma externa. Genetic analyses of fossil bones are needed to confirm this suspicion. Yet, we cannot exclude that a breeding population of Juan Fernandez petrel could have been overlooked as Amsterdam surveys have been incomplete. Observations at dusk of a large gadfly petrel with whitish underparts on Amsterdam in January and February 2003 may correspond to a Juan Fernandez petrel, and similar observations made on St. Paul in April 2013 with an individual observed landing in a cliff, which may suggest that the species is also present on St. Paul. Moreover, one sighting at sea approximately 800 km north of Crozet in January 2003 and two sightings approximately 1,400 km and approximately 1,700 km northwest of Kerguelen in February 2004 indicate the presence of the species in the Indian Ocean, soft-plumaged petrel. This species breeds in several islands of the Southern Ocean. Go, Tristan da Cunha, Antipodes and Martsyker Islands. Soft-plumaged petrel is known to persist as a breeding species on Amsterdam, but suffers from predation by rats and cats on adults, eggs and chicks. Fossil remains suggest that the species was abundant on Amsterdam. Our data show the regular presence of the species almost all year round, from July to April, with a peak of contact records from October to December. Observations of several individuals in burrows with camera traps from our survey, regular visual and auditory records, and remains of skulls predated by cats or rats indicate that the species still breeds on Amsterdam. An adult soft-plumaged petrel was captured on St. Paul after calls of the species were heard, but breeding has not been confirmed. Great-winged petrel. This species breeds on several subantarctic islands, southwest Australia, Amsterdam and St. Paul, Tristan da Cunha and Go. Abundant fossil remains suggest that great-winged petrels were formerly abundant on Amsterdam. The species is regularly seen offshore Amsterdam from February to April and between July and September, and has been regularly recorded during the austral winter on Amsterdam since the 1980s. Our data show the regular presence of the species on Amsterdam from February to July. Observation of an occupied burrow and of individuals with camera traps from our survey indicates that species still breeds on Amsterdam. Great-winged petrels breed on St. Paul with 130–150 occupied burrows. Grey petrel. The species breeds on many islands of the Southern Ocean and South Atlantic, as well as Antipodes and Campbell Islands in the Pacific. Our data confirm that the species breeds on Amsterdam as it was frequently recorded and observed entering burrows from February to September. The species has regularly been observed at dusk flying on land or entering burrows where it breeds in small numbers, a remnant of what may once have been a much larger copulation. However, the species frequent areas in steep slopes and cliffs, making the access to burrows extremely difficult. It is also a probable breeder in small numbers on St. Paul. Spectacled petrel. Only one visual observation on land was made in April, thus outside the breeding season, and no acoustic or camera trap record was obtained for this species. Therefore, it is likely not breeding on Amsterdam, and no fossil remain was found suggesting it has never bred, or perhaps in extremely small numbers. The species is endemic from Inaccessible Island in the South Atlantic, where its breeding numbers are increasing following the eradication of feral pigs sus scrofa. Tracking studies suggest the species stays in the Southern Atlantic Ocean during both the breeding and non-breeding periods. Albeit sample sizes of tracked individuals were low, Nevertheless, spectacled petrels appear to frequent, occasionally the Indian Ocean, as individuals are very occasionally observed offshore Amsterdam and Kerguelen. Flesh-footed shearwater. The main breeding populations are situated on islands off South and Western Australia and North New Zealand to Cook Strait, where they have been declining. Although the species breeds on St. Paul, there were very few observational records on Amsterdam, apart from fossil records suggesting that the species formerly bred. One adult was captured on Amsterdam in 1953, and another was found on the ground nearby the Martin de Vivis research station in October 2016, but their status was unknown. The discovery of a chick is proof that the species reproduces in Amsterdam. The species may have gone locally extinct and has been recolonizing the island relatively recently. Indeed, the population of fresh-footed shearwaters has been increasing on St. Paul since the early 1980s, where at least 2,000 pairs were breeding in 2018. Sooty shearwater. This species occurs in all oceans and breeds in South Chile, Falkland Islands, Tristan da Cunha, Southeast Australia and New Zealand. Although this is an extremely numerous species, there are persistent signs of current decline. This new breeding species for Amsterdam was only known from extremely few fossils, remains and occasional observations at the offshore Amsterdam and St. Paul. Therefore, as for the flesh-footed shearwater, it is possible that the species was breeding on Amsterdam, but in very few numbers and remained undetected, or that it went locally extinct and has been recolonizing the island relatively recently. Common diving petrel. This species breeds in high numbers on subantarctic and subtropical islands of the southern hemisphere. Fossil remains were found at several places, suggesting the species formerly bred at Amsterdam. A female was captured in November 1955. A dead individual was found in December 1984, and Mikkel and Juventin suspected that the species breeds at Amsterdam. Acoustic records from our survey indicate the regular presence of common diving petrels during the breeding season from August to December, which suggests that a small population still breeds on Amsterdam. Surprisingly, there is only one at-sea observation of the species approximately 300 km south of Amsterdam, and the species has never been observed on or nearby St. Paul. Indeed, the species breeds at Tristan da Cunha, where it is regularly observed at sea, but breeding numbers are relatively high at this locality. During breeding, the foraging range of common diving petrel can reach more than 200 km, and individuals come back to colonies at night to avoid predators. This and the likely very small breeding numbers on Amsterdam might explain the quasi-absence of at-sea observations. To conclude, his pre-eradication survey on Amsterdam revealed the presence of 5 unrecorded species and suggests the breeding of 4 additional species compared to Jury's and DELORD, the island totalizing at least 14 breeding seabird species. Acoustic recording devices were extremely useful to identify and locate burrow nesting and nocturnal species, offering several advantages such as being easy to deploy and retrieve and recording simultaneously at multiple sites. Other surveys are needed to better evaluate the breeding status of some of these species and to obtain tissue samples to assess the phylogenetic status of their populations. Surprisingly, we did not detect the presence of species for which relatively abundant fossil bones were found, as the little shearwater, white-faced storm petrel, and white-bellied storm petrel. It is also surprising to note that some species breeding on St. Paul were not identified on Amsterdam are the white-bellied petrels, very prion, and especially the subantarctic shearwater that is increasing on St. Paul. Individuals assumed to belong to Puffinus assimiles were observed in flight on Amsterdam in 1956, but there is no recent record on any of the 2 islands. Fresh remains of white-faced storm petrels are regularly found in pellets of brown skuas on Amsterdam, suggesting the presence of the species on the island, yet to be discovered. Finally, based on these new records and on seabird population trends observed on St. Paul following eradication of invasive mammals, the Introduce Mammal Eradication campaign on Amsterdam will be extremely beneficial for seabird conservation, if successful, and may also favour the colonisation of Amsterdam by new seabird species in the future. The authors declare no competing interests.